For 8 long months, a billionaire's son had not spoken a single word. Not after doctors came, not after therapists tried, not after money was spent without limit. Inside the Harrington mansion, silence ruled every room. A silence so heavy it made the walls feel alive. 5-year-old Ethan Harrington had watched his mother lowered into the ground. And from that day, his voice disappeared. No laughter, no cries, no words. His father, Alexander Harrington, told himself it would pass. He told himself work would dull the pain. He told himself money could fix anything. But then, on a day that was never planned, Alexander came home early. He opened his front door, expecting the same empty quiet. Instead, he heard something that made his legs stop moving. A sound he had not heard in 8 months. His son's laughter. And when Alexander followed that sound, what he saw inside his own house would change everything he believed about healing, grief, and love. Because it was not a doctor. It was not a therapist. It was not money. It was the new housekeeper. And what she was doing with his silent son would break his heart and slowly put it back together again. Alexander Harrington stood just inside the front door of his mansion, his hand still resting on the handle, his coat half open, his briefcase hanging loosely from his fingers. He had come home early without telling anyone, not the driver, not the house staff, not even his assistant. He had planned to walk into silence, the same silence that greeted him every night. He expected the house to feel empty, calm, and distant, just the way it had felt for 8 long months. But silence was not what he heard. The sound came again, light and sudden, breaking through the still air like something alive. It was laughter, a child's laughter, high, careless, real. Alexander's breath stopped halfway in his chest. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor with a dull sound that echoed through the hallway. He did not move. He did not even blink. His mind searched for an answer. Any answer that could make sense of what his ears were telling him. For a moment, he wondered if grief had finally taken his reason. Then the sound came again, louder this time. There was no doubt now. That laugh belonged to his son, Ethan. Alexander's legs felt weak, like they were no longer listening to him. 8 months. For 8 months, he had waited to hear any sound from his child. Not a word, not a cry, not even a laugh. He had sat through quiet dinners, walked through empty halls, and slept in a bed that felt too large without his wife. He had told himself that silence was normal, that children healed in time. But hearing that laugh now, it cut through him in a way he was not ready for. He moved without thinking, following the sound deeper into the house. His shoes tapped softly against the floor as he passed the long hallway, the tall mirrors, the wide staircase. The sound pulled him forward, step by step, until he reached the indoor conservatory at the back of the house. This conservatory had once been his wife's favorite place. Elena had filled it with lush plants, hanging vines, and soft chairs where she would sit with Ethan in the mornings, reading books, or talking to him about simple things. After her death, Alexander had avoided this room. It carried too many memories. Now he stood at the doorway, frozen. Ethan was in the middle of the conservatory, sitting on the back of a young woman. She was down on her hands and knees, moving slowly across the stone floor, making playful sounds as if she were a horse. Ethan held onto her shoulders, his small body bouncing as she crawled. His mouth was open in laughter, his face bright, his whole body shaking with joy. Alexander had to grip the door frame to stay standing. The woman laughed too, not loud, not forced, but free. Her dark hair was tied back, a few loose strands falling near her face. She looked relaxed, unafraid, fully present in that moment. She was not worried about rules or appearances or what anyone might say. This was Isabella, the new housekeeper. Alexander had hired her without much thought. He needed someone to fill the space left by another staff member who quit. He had glanced at her file, barely reading it, and approved the hire. To him, she was meant to clean, cook, and stay unnoticed. Yet here she was, bringing his house back to life. Isabella slowed and stopped when she noticed him standing there. She did not jump up. She did not panic. She gently helped Ethan slide down from her back and steady himself on his feet. Ethan was still laughing, his cheeks flushed, his breath quick from excitement. Then Ethan saw his father. The laughter faded into a quiet smile. Ethan looked at Alexander for a moment, studying his face as if seeing him clearly for the first time in months. Then, without fear or hesitation, Ethan took a step forward. Then another, then another. Alexander dropped to his knees. He reached out and wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close. Ethan's body was warm, light, and real. Ethan pressed his face into Alexander's chest, letting out a soft giggle, the sound vibrating against Alexander's heart. Alexander closed his eyes. Something inside him broke open. For months, he had carried guilt, regret, and questions with no answers. He had wondered if he failed as a father. He had wondered if his son blamed him for his mother's death. He had wondered if silence was all that remained. Now holding Ethan, he felt hope for the first time. He looked up at Isabella, his eyes wet, his voice unsteady. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Isabella wiped her hands on her jeans and met his gaze calmly. "It's just play," she said. That's all he needed. Alexander wanted to argue. He wanted to demand explanations. He wanted to understand how something so simple could succeed where so much effort had failed. But no words came. He sat down on the stone bench under the vines, still holding Ethan. Ethan rested against him, his small fingers gripping the fabric of Alexander's jacket as if he was afraid to let go. Isabella sat across from them, not waiting to be invited. She did not act proud. She did not smile for praise. She simply sat present watching Ethan breathe. "I didn't try to fix him," she said softly. "I listened." Alexander swallowed hard. He realized how many times he had walked past his son, distracted by phone calls, meetings, and flights. How many times he had assumed professionals would handle what he could not face. "You did what no one else could," Alexander whispered. Isabella shook her head gently. "I just didn't walk away." That night, Ethan fell asleep quickly, curled around a stuffed dinosaur Isabella had found in an old box. Alexander stood at the doorway of his son's room long after the lights were turned off, watching his chest rise and fall. Fear crept in beside hope. What if tomorrow the silence returned? What if today was only a moment? Downstairs, Alexander found Isabella cleaning the kitchen. She moved slowly, quietly, humming under her breath. Alexander watched her for a moment before speaking. "How did you do it?" he asked. Isabella did not stop moving. "I played." Alexander frowned. "Doctors couldn't reach him." She set the cloth down and looked at him. "Sometimes children don't need fixing," she said. "Sometimes they need someone to stay." Alexander felt the truth of her words settle deep inside him. The next morning, he woke early, expecting silence. Instead, he heard crayons scraping softly across paper. He stood in the doorway of the playroom and watched Ethan sit on the floor beside Isabella, drawing shapes. Ethan looked up and smiled. It was small, but it was real. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. As the day passed, he noticed something else. Isabella never pushed. She never rushed. She treated Ethan like a normal boy. Not fragile, not broken. That night, Alexander stayed home. For the first time in months, he chose not to leave. And somewhere deep inside the Harrington mansion, something long buried had begun to breathe again. That night, Alexander Harrington did not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. The air felt different, lighter, but also fragile, like something that could disappear if he breathed too hard. Every few minutes, he got up and walked softly to Ethan's room. He stood at the doorway, watching his son sleep, counting each rise of his chest, afraid the peace might break. For 8 months, silence had been his enemy. Now silence scared him for a different reason. What if the laughter was gone by morning? When the sun finally rose, Alexander was already awake. He moved through the house slowly, as if the walls themselves might shatter if he rushed. He expected to hear nothing, to feel that familiar hollow feeling settle back into his chest. But then he heard it. Not laughter, something softer, the sound of crayons moving across paper. Alexander stopped in the hallway. His heart beat slowly, heavy and careful. He stepped closer to the playroom and stood just outside the door. Ethan sat on the floor, legs crossed, his back straight. A box of crayons spilled beside him. Isabella sat nearby, drawing crooked shapes on a sheet of paper. They were not talking. There was no pressure, no instruction, just quiet togetherness. Ethan lifted his head and noticed his father. For a moment, Alexander froze, afraid to move. He had learned fear in small moments. Fear of pushing too much. Fear of losing what little progress had come. But then Ethan smiled. Not big, not loud, but real. Alexander felt his throat tighten. Isabella glanced over her shoulder and gave Alexander a small nod as if telling him it was okay to stay where he was. Alexander stayed by the door, hands resting at his sides, watching his son color inside and outside the lines. For the first time since Alina's death, Alexander felt like a guest in his own home. And for the first time, he did not mind. Later that morning, Alexander canceled his meetings. His assistant was confused. This had never happened before. Alexander did not explain. He stayed home, moving quietly from room to room, watching moments he had missed for too long. Isabella moved through the house calmly, not rushing, not asking for permission. She involved Ethan in simple things, washing apples, folding towels, watering plants in the conservatory. She never treated him like he was broken. She treated him like he belonged. Alexander noticed that Ethan followed her everywhere. Not clinging, not desperate, just present. When Isabella walked into another room, Ethan followed his small steps steady. When she stopped, he stopped. When she smiled, he smiled. Something inside Alexander ached. He remembered how Ethan used to follow Elena the same way. That afternoon, Alexander found himself sitting in his study, staring at his phone. A message blinked on the screen. A reminder about a flight scheduled for that night. Chicago. Another meeting. Another deal. Another excuse. He closed the phone and placed it face down on the desk. In the living room, Isabella sat on the floor sorting laundry. Ethan rummaged through an old toy box, pulling out cars, blocks, and forgotten pieces of his childhood. Alexander watched from his chair, pretending to read a book. Ethan suddenly stopped and lifted a small object from the box. It was an old voice recorder. Alexander recognized it immediately. Elena had used it once to record Ethan's first words. Isabella noticed the object in Ethan's hand and knelt beside him. "That record sounds," she said gently. "You press this button and it listens." Ethan turned it over, pressing buttons, studying it carefully. "The red button saves your voice," Isabella continued. "The black one lets you hear it." The batteries were dead. Isabella left the room and returned with new ones, replacing them slowly, showing Ethan each step. She handed it back to him like it was something precious. Ethan held it tightly. That night, after Isabella tucked him into bed and turned off the light, Alexander stood by the window in his own room, watching the city glow in the distance. His mind raced with questions. Was this real? Was it safe to hope? Down the hall, Ethan slipped quietly from his bed. He padded across the floor, holding the recorder close to his chest. He crouched near the staircase where the shadows felt safe. His finger hovered over the button. His breathing grew fast, uneven. He pressed it. There was silence. Then a small sound escaped his mouth. "Isabella." Ethan gasped and pressed stop. His eyes filled with fear and wonder. He hugged the recorder and returned to his bed, curling under the blanket. The next morning, Isabella found the recorder on the kitchen counter. She almost ignored it, but something inside her urged her to press play. A tiny voice filled the room. "Isabella." Her knees gave out. She sank to the floor, covering her mouth, tears spilling freely. She shook with quiet sobs, not wanting to wake the house. Alexander walked in moments later, and stopped. "What happened?" he asked. Isabella held up the recorder, her hands trembling. "He said my name," she whispered. Alexander took it gently, pressing play. The sound filled his ears, small but clear. His son's voice. Alexander pressed the recorder to his chest and sank into a chair. Tears he had held back for months finally came. He spoke, he said softly. Isabella nodded. That afternoon, Alexander stayed close. Ethan did not speak again. Not yet, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. That evening, Alexander told Isabella about the flight. I was supposed to leave, he said. Isabella did not react. He knows when you go, she replied. Later that night, Alexander packed his bag. As he lifted it, a piece of paper slipped out. A crayon drawing, a red airplane, flames around it, a small figure beneath, crying. 2 words written shakily. Ethan sad. Alexander sat on the bed holding the paper with shaking hands. He pushed the bag into the closet. In the playroom, Ethan sat curled in the corner. Alexander joined him on the floor. I saw your picture, Alexander whispered. I'm not leaving. Ethan leaned against him. Days passed. Laughter returned in small pieces. Smiles, humming, gestures. One evening, Isabella chased a sock into an upstairs hallway and stopped in front of a locked door. What's in there? She asked softly later at breakfast. Alexander's face closed. Nobody goes in there. That night, Isabella placed a glass of warm milk outside the door with a note. You don't have to open it. Just don't keep it closed forever. The milk disappeared by morning. A day later, Ethan tripped and fell while running. He cried out. Alexander rushed forward, lifting him. I'm here, Alexander said. Daddy's here. Ethan clutched his shirt and whispered, Daddy. Alexander froze, then held him tighter. From the stairs, Isabella watched, tears in her eyes, and walked away. That night, under the glass roof of the conservatory, Isabella spoke of a boy she once cared for. A boy who stopped speaking. A boy she failed to return to in time. I stayed this time, she said. Alexander listened. Weeks later, Alexander opened the locked door. Alina's room. He transformed it into a place for Ethan. Books, cushions, light. They painted handprints together. Blue, green, orange. Ethan wrote one word, family, and the house finally became a home. The word stayed in Alexander Harrington's mind long after the night ended. Family. Ethan had written it with shaky hands, uneven letters, but the meaning was clear. That single word carried more weight than any contract Alexander had ever signed. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the past weeks. The laughter, the small smiles, the sound of his son's voice captured in a tiny recorder. The way Ethan had leaned into him and whispered, Daddy, like it was something fragile, something he was afraid to lose. Alexander had built empires, skyscrapers, and fortunes. But none of it had prepared him for the fear he felt now. Fear of losing this progress. Fear of making one wrong move. Fear that silence might return. The next morning, Alexander woke early and went straight to Ethan's room. He did not open the door right away. He listened. The house was quiet, but it was a living quiet now, not the dead silence that once haunted him. He finally pushed the door open. Ethan was awake, sitting up in bed, holding the voice recorder in both hands. He was not pressing any buttons. He was just holding it like it was a small piece of courage. Alexander stepped inside slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. Good morning, he said softly. Ethan looked at him. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. No word came. Alexander felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but he did not rush. He stayed still. Ethan shifted closer and rested his head against Alexander's arm. That was enough. Downstairs, Isabella was already awake, preparing breakfast. She moved quietly, aware that the house was still finding its rhythm. When she heard footsteps, she turned and saw Alexander carrying Ethan down the stairs. The boy's arms were wrapped around his father's neck, his head resting on Alexander's shoulder. Isabella paused, watching. Alexander caught her eye and nodded. A silent thank you. Isabella smiled gently and went back to slicing fruit. Breakfast passed without words, but it was not empty. Ethan pointed at the bowl he wanted. Isabella slid it closer. Alexander poured juice carefully, watching his son's every move like it was something new. Later that morning, Alexander received a call. His assistant's voice came through the phone, sharp and urgent. There was a meeting that could not be delayed. Investors were waiting. Planes were booked. Alexander looked across the room at Ethan, who sat on the floor, lining up toy cars, humming softly under his breath. "I can't go today," Alexander said. There was silence on the line. "This is important," the assistant replied. "So is my son," Alexander said, and ended the call. Isabella looked up from the counter, surprised. Alexander felt unsure, but also steady. For the first time, he was choosing something that could not be replaced. That afternoon, Alexander tried something he had not done in months. He sat on the floor with Ethan, not to teach, not to test, just to be there. Ethan pushed a car toward him. Alexander pushed it back. They did this again and again. Isabella watched from a distance, careful not to interfere. Then it happened. Ethan picked up the recorder and pressed the red button. His face tightened with focus. His lips moved barely. "Car," he whispered. Alexander froze. Isabella turned slowly. Ethan pressed stop and stared at the recorder, breathing hard. Alexander did not react right away. He remembered Isabella's words. "Don't rush. Don't turn it into pressure." "That was good," Alexander said calmly. Ethan looked at him, unsure. Isabella nodded gently. "You can play it later," she said. Ethan held the recorder close. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at a framed photo of Elena. She was smiling, holding baby Ethan in her arms. Alexander felt the ache rise in his chest. "I failed him," he whispered. The door creaked softly. Isabella stood there, unsure if she should step inside. Alexander gestured for her to come in. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Being here, staying." Isabella sat across from him. "You don't have to know. You just have to keep choosing it." Alexander nodded slowly. That night, Ethan woke from a bad dream. He cried out sharp and scared. Alexander reached him before the sound could echo through the hall. He lifted his son and held him close. "It's okay," Alexander whispered. "I'm here." Ethan clutched his shirt and buried his face against him. No words came, but trust did. The days that followed were not perfect. Ethan had moments when he pulled away, moments when he refused food, moments when he sat silently staring at nothing. Alexander felt panic each time. Isabella noticed. "He's not going backward," she said one evening. "He's resting." Alexander learned to breathe through it. One afternoon, Alexander found Ethan sitting by the locked door at the end of the hall, the door to Alina's old room. Ethan traced the wood with his fingers. "What's in there?" Alexander asked quietly. Ethan looked up at him, then at the door. He pressed the recorder. "Mama," he whispered. Alexander's knees weakened. He knelt beside his son and placed his hand on the door. "That was your mom's room," he said. "She loved you." Ethan leaned against him. That night, Alexander stood outside the door for a long time before unlocking it. The room smelled like dust and memories. Everything was still frozen in time. Alexander did not step inside. He just opened the door and let the air move. Isabella watched from the hallway, her eyes full. Later, Isabella finally told Alexander more about her past, about the boy named Leo, about how she left and never returned, about the hospital call that came too late. "I promised myself I would never walk away again," she said. Alexander listened without interrupting. "You didn't fail him," Alexander said. "You stayed this time." Isabella lowered her eyes. One evening, Ethan brought Alexander a drawing. It showed 3 figures holding hands, one tall, one small, one with long hair. "Us," Ethan whispered. Alexander held the paper like it might tear. Weeks passed. Words came slowly. One here, one there. Never forced, never rushed. Alexander stayed home more. The company adjusted. The world did not collapse. One afternoon, Ethan ran through the house laughing, the sound filling rooms that once held only quiet. Alexander stood still, letting the sound wash over him. He realized something then. Healing was not loud. It was patient and it stayed. Alexander Harrington began to understand something he had never learned before. Healing did not move in straight lines. Some mornings, Ethan woke up smiling, ready to follow Isabella from room to room, humming softly as she worked. Other mornings, he sat quietly on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, his small hands folded in his lap like he was holding something fragile inside himself. On those mornings, Alexander felt fear creep back into his chest. He had to fight the urge to rush in and fix it. Isabella noticed his struggle. One morning, as she poured cereal into a bowl, Alexander stood beside the counter, watching Ethan sit at the table without touching his food. "He's quiet again," Alexander whispered. Isabella did not look worried. "Quiet doesn't mean lost," she said. "It just means he's thinking." Alexander nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. Ethan eventually reached for his spoon. That small movement felt like a victory. Alexander did not celebrate out loud. Later that day, Alexander received an email from his company's board. They wanted him back in the office. There were questions about his absence. Concerns about leadership. Alexander stared at the screen for a long time. That evening, he brought it up to Isabella while Ethan played on the rug. "They want me back," Alexander said. "Just for a few days." Isabella's expression softened, but she did not answer right away. She watched Ethan stack blocks, knocking them over and laughing quietly. "He will feel it," she said at last. "Even if he doesn't say it." Alexander's chest tightened. "I can't disappear again." Isabella nodded. "Then don't." That night Alexander lay awake, torn between the life he had built and the child who needed him now. He thought of all the times he had told himself work came first. He thought of the drawing of the airplane and the words Ethan said. In the early hours of the morning, Alexander sent a message to the board. He was stepping back for now. The reply came quickly. Surprise, pressure, questions. Alexander turned his phone face down and went to Ethan's room. Ethan was asleep, his face calm. One hand curled around the recorder. Alexander sat beside the bed until the sun rose. The days that followed felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because Alexander was present. Heavier because he could no longer hide. Ethan began speaking in small pieces, single words, whispered at first, then repeated when he felt safe. Colors, animals, simple needs. Isabella never reacted strongly. She nodded, smiled, and carried on. Alexander struggled more. Every word felt like a miracle to him. Every pause felt like danger. One afternoon, Ethan asked for water. "Water," he said clearly, looking straight at Alexander. Alexander froze, then moved too fast, nearly spilling the glass. Isabella touched his arm gently. "Easy," she said. Alexander laughed quietly, embarrassed and emotional all at once. That evening, Ethan refused to sleep. He sat up in bed, eyes fixed on the doorway, breathing fast. Alexander sat beside him. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. Ethan hesitated. His lips trembled. "Mama," he whispered. Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. Isabella stood at the door, sensing the weight of the moment. Alexander pulled Ethan close. "I know," he said. "I miss her, too." Ethan's body shook as quiet sobs broke free. It was the first time he had cried like this since the funeral. Alexander held him, rocking slowly, letting the pain move instead of stopping it. Isabella closed the door gently and gave them privacy. That night, Alexander cried too. Not silently, not hidden, he cried beside his son. The next day, Ethan was tired, but calmer. Isabella suggested something new. "Let's go outside," she said. "Not far." Alexander hesitated. Ethan had not left the property in months, but he nodded. They walked into the conservatory, then beyond it to the edge of the yard, where a small bench faced the trees. Ethan held Alexander's hand tightly. Isabella walked a few steps behind, letting them lead. The air was cool. Birds moved between branches. Ethan pointed. "Bird," he said. Alexander smiled. "Yes." They sat in silence, listening. That night, Isabella found Alexander standing by the locked door again. "You're thinking about opening it," she said. Alexander nodded. "I'm scared." Isabella understood. "You don't have to rush," she said. "But he knows what's behind it." Alexander looked down the hall toward Ethan's room. "He asked about her," Alexander said. "Really asked." Isabella rested her hand on the door. "Then maybe it's time to let her be part of the healing." 2 days later, Alexander opened the door fully. Alina's room had not changed. Her clothes hung neatly. Her books sat untouched. Her scent lingered faintly. Ethan stood beside Alexander, gripping his hand. "This was Mama's room," Alexander said slowly. Ethan stepped inside. He walked to the bed and touched the blanket. His face tightened, but he did not cry. Isabella stayed by the door. Alexander knelt beside Ethan. "She loved you," he said. "She still does." Ethan nodded once. That night, Ethan slept in Alexander's bed. The days that followed brought new challenges. Ethan began asking questions. Short ones, hard ones. "Why Mama go?" he asked one evening. Alexander swallowed. "She got sick," he said. "And she couldn't stay." Ethan frowned. "She come back." Alexander's heart broke. "No," he said gently. "But she's with us in other ways." Ethan grew quiet. Isabella later found Alexander sitting alone, staring at nothing. "You're doing it," she said. "Even when it hurts." Alexander nodded. "I wish I had done it sooner." Isabella said nothing. One afternoon, Ethan disappeared from the living room. Panic surged through Alexander. He searched the house, calling softly. He found Ethan in Alina's room, holding a scarf. "Mama smell," Ethan said. Alexander knelt beside him. "You can keep it," he said. Ethan hugged the scarf to his chest. That night, Alexander dreamed of Elena. She was smiling, calm. When he woke, his chest felt lighter. Weeks passed. Ethan's words grew more frequent. Short sentences, soft questions. Alexander learned to answer honestly, simply. Isabella remained steady, never pushing, never pulling. One evening, Alexander overheard Ethan speaking to Isabella in the kitchen. "Stay," Ethan said. Isabella paused. "I'm here," she replied. Ethan nodded. Alexander turned away, wiping his eyes. That night, Alexander realized something else. Isabella had become part of their story, and he feared what would happen if she ever left. The fear did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly into Alexander Harrington's chest, mostly at night, when the house was quiet, and Ethan was asleep. During the day, Alexander stayed busy with small tasks. He helped pour juice. He picked up toys. He read stories slowly, even when his voice shook. But when darkness fell, and the house grew still, his thoughts grew louder. He watched Isabella move through the kitchen, careful and calm, her presence steady like it had become part of the walls. He watched Ethan run toward her when he woke from naps, when he needed comfort, when he felt unsure. Alexander was grateful, deeply grateful. But the gratitude carried fear inside it. What happens if she leaves? He had already buried his wife. He had already lived through months of silence that nearly broke him. The idea of losing the person who helped bring his son back from that place felt unbearable. Ethan felt the tension, too. Children always do. One morning, while Isabella helped Ethan button his shirt, his small fingers trembling with effort, he suddenly stopped and looked up at her. "You go," he said quietly. Isabella's hands paused, but she did not pull away. "Go where?" she asked gently. Ethan frowned, searching for the right words. His mouth opened, then closed. "Away," he said. Isabella finished the button and knelt so her face was level with his. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan studied her face like he was trying to memorize it. He nodded, but his eyes stayed worried. Alexander stood in the hallway and watched everything. Later that day, Alexander's phone rang. He knew before answering that the call would not bring peace. It was the board. Their voices were firm, sharp, tired of waiting. They spoke of responsibility, leadership, pressure from investors. They asked questions that were not really questions. When are you coming back? How long do you plan to stay away? Do you understand what is at risk? Alexander listened without interrupting. His grip on the phone tightened when the call ended. His hand stayed frozen against his ear for a long time. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study, surrounded by papers he did not want to read. Contracts, reports, schedules. All the things that once defined him now felt heavy and distant. Isabella knocked softly before stepping inside. "You've been quiet all evening," she said. Alexander rubbed his face, exhaustion clear in his posture. "They want me back full-time," he said. "Not part-time, not later. Now, Isabella sat across from him. She did not speak right away. They say if I don't return, Alexander continued, there will be consequences, control issues, votes, people questioning if I'm still fit to lead. Isabella folded her hands in her lap. And what do you want? She asked. Alexander let out a slow breath. I don't want to choose, he admitted. I built that company. It took years of my life. Isabella met his eyes. And this, she said gently, is taking your heart. Alexander looked away. What if I lose everything I built? Isabella's voice was calm but firm. You already lost what mattered once. You were given a second chance. Don't trade it for the same mistake. The words settled deep. That night, Ethan woke crying. The sound cut through the house sharply. Alexander reached his room first, lifting him from the bed before the cry could grow louder. Ethan clung to him, shaking. Bad dream, Ethan whispered. I'm here, Alexander said, rocking him gently. Ethan pressed his face against Alexander's neck. Isabella, stay. Alexander closed his eyes. She's here, he said softly. She's not leaving. But even as he said it, fear twisted tighter in his chest. The next day brought something Alexander was not prepared for. A visitor arrived without warning. She introduced herself as Victoria, a relative from Alina's side of the family. She said she had been worried about Ethan and wanted to check on him. From the moment she stepped inside, the air shifted. Her eyes moved quickly around the house, judging everything. When she saw Isabella, her lips tightened. And who is this? Victoria asked sharply. Isabella stood straight. My name is Isabella. I work here. Victoria's gaze dropped to Ethan, who stood pressed close to Isabella's side, gripping her hand tightly. He's far too attached, Victoria said bluntly. This isn't healthy. Alexander felt anger rise fast. You don't understand what he's been through. Victoria sighed. He needs structure, therapy, distance, not dependence on staff. Ethan's breathing grew fast. His fingers dug into Isabella's hand. Isabella knelt beside him immediately. It's okay, she whispered. Alexander stepped forward. His voice was steady but hard. You need to leave. Victoria looked stunned. Alexander, you're not thinking clearly. I am, Alexander said. And you don't get to decide what my son needs. Victoria left without another word. As soon as the door closed, Ethan broke down. The sobs came deep and raw, the kind that shake a small body. Alexander lifted him, holding him close, whispering comfort again and again. Isabella stayed nearby, quiet and steady. That night, Ethan refused to sleep unless Isabella sat beside his bed. Alexander allowed it, though doubt crept in again. What if everyone else was right? What if this was too much? The next morning, Isabella made a choice. She asked Alexander to sit with her in the conservatory. I need to talk to you, she said. Alexander's chest tightened. I won't disappear from his life, Isabella said carefully. But he needs to trust that you can hold him without me always there. Alexander shook his head. He needs you. Yes, Isabella said, but he needs you more. Alexander's voice broke. I'm scared I'll fail him. Isabella leaned forward slightly. You already stayed. That matters more than you know. They agreed on slow steps. Isabella would pull back gently, not leaving, not vanishing, just making space. That evening, when Ethan asked Isabella to read him a story, she smiled softly. Let Daddy do it tonight. Ethan hesitated. His eyes searched her face. Isabella nodded. I'll be right outside. Alexander sat on the bed and opened the book. His voice shook at first. He stumbled over words, but Ethan listened closely, his small body tense, then slowly relaxing. When the story ended, Ethan whispered, again tomorrow. Alexander smiled. Yes. Over the next days, Isabella stepped back little by little. Alexander stepped forward. There were tears. There were moments when Ethan called for Isabella instead, but Alexander stayed. Each time, one afternoon, Ethan fell while running through the hall. He cried out. Alexander reached him first. I've got you, he said, holding him close. Ethan nodded against his chest. Daddy got me. Isabella watched from across the room, tears filling her eyes. That night, Alexander found Isabella packing a small bag. What are you doing? He asked, panic rising. I'm not leaving, she said gently. I'm staying at my sister's place tonight. He needs to see that I can go and still come back. Ethan cried when he saw the bag. Isabella knelt and held his face. I'll be back tomorrow, she promised. Ethan looked to Alexander. Alexander knelt beside him. I'm here, he said. All night. That night was long. Ethan woke twice crying. Alexander held him through both. By morning, Ethan slept peacefully. When Isabella returned, Ethan ran to her, then ran back to Alexander, grabbing both their hands. Isabella smiled through tears. That day, Alexander made his choice. He resigned from his position quietly. Not for praise, not for drama, for his son. When he told Isabella, she stared at him in disbelief. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Alexander said, I did. Ethan sat between them. Drawing family, he said, writing the word again. The house felt steady, but deep inside, Alexander knew one final test still waited. The letter was sent quietly. Alexander Harrington did not hold a press conference. He did not call reporters. He did not explain himself to the world that once watched his every move. He resigned from his position the same way he had learned to live again. Without noise, without pride, without fear. The company would survive. It always did, but this moment in his home with his son and the woman who helped bring him back could not be replaced. The first morning after his resignation felt strange. Alexander woke early out of habit, his body expecting meetings and calls. But instead of reaching for his phone, he listened. He heard soft movement down the hall, small footsteps, a quiet hum. Ethan. Alexander sat up slowly and smiled. When he entered the kitchen, Ethan was already there with Isabella. He stood on a small stool, carefully stirring oatmeal, his tongue pressed against his lip in deep focus. Daddy, Ethan said softly without fear. The words still felt unreal every time Alexander heard it. I'm here, Alexander replied. Isabella looked at Alexander and smiled. Not wide, not proud, just calm. The kind of smile that comes from knowing something hard has finally settled into place. That day, Alexander did something he had not done in years. Nothing. No calls, no emails, no plans. He spent the day with Ethan. They built a small fort in the living room using pillows and blankets. Ethan laughed when the fort collapsed. Alexander laughed with him, not carefully, not quietly, but freely. Isabella watched from the doorway folding laundry, her eyes filled with quiet relief. In the afternoon, Ethan pulled Alexander toward the stairs. Room, he said. Alexander knew which one. Alina's room. The door was no longer locked, but Alexander still felt a tightness in his chest every time he stepped inside. Ethan walked in slowly, holding Alexander's hand. He carried the scarf he had taken days earlier. Ethan placed it on the bed carefully. Mama, he whispered. Alexander knelt beside him. Yes, he said. This was Mama's. Ethan touched the pillow, then looked up at Alexander. Mama loved me. Alexander swallowed hard. She loved you more than anything. Ethan nodded, accepting it in the simple way children do. That night, Ethan slept peacefully. Alexander sat beside his bed long after he fell asleep, watching his chest rise and fall. He felt something settle inside him, something that had been missing since the day he buried his wife. Peace. Not the kind that erases pain, the kind that makes room for it. Days turned into weeks. Ethan's words came slowly, but they came. He spoke in short sentences. He asked simple questions. He laughed without fear. He cried when he needed to. Alexander learned to answer without rushing. Isabella remained steady through it all. She never asked for praise. She never reminded Alexander of what she had done. She simply stayed, cooking, cleaning, listening, caring. One afternoon, Alexander overheard Ethan talking to himself while playing with toy animals. Daddy stay, Ethan said. Isabella stay. I stay. Alexander had to step outside to breathe. That evening, Alexander asked Isabella to sit with him in the conservatory. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Isabella looked confused. You don't need to. You stayed when it was hard, Alexander said. You saw my son when I couldn't. Isabella looked down. I just didn't want to walk away again. Alexander studied her face. You saved more than my son, he said. You saved me. Isabella shook her head gently. You chose to stay. That was you. Silence fell between them, not heavy, not awkward, comfortable. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was from the board. They accepted Alexander's resignation. There were polite words, regret, offers to reconsider. Alexander placed the letter in a drawer and closed it. That chapter of his life was done. The next morning, Alexander surprised Ethan. We're going somewhere, he said. Ethan looked nervous. Far? No, Alexander said. Together, they went to the park. It was the first time Ethan had been outside the property in months. He held Alexander's hand tightly at first. Isabella walked beside them, close but not hovering. At the park, Ethan watched other children play. He did not join them right away. He stood still, observing. Alexander knelt beside him. It's okay, he said. We're here. Ethan nodded. After a few minutes, he let go of Alexander's hand and took one step forward, then another. He joined the other children. Alexander felt tears rise, but he did not move. Isabella squeezed his arm lightly. That night, Ethan slept deeply. Later, Alexander and Isabella sat at the kitchen table, tired but full. I want you to stay, Alexander said quietly. Not as staff. Isabella looked at him surprised. Your family, Alexander continued. If you want to be. Isabella's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. I'm staying because this is where I belong. Ethan wandered into the room, rubbing his eyes. Family, he said sleepily. Alexander lifted him. Yes, he whispered. Family. Months later, the Harrington mansion was no longer quiet. Laughter filled the halls. Crayon marks decorated the walls. Toys sat where they were used, not hidden away. Alexander no longer measured life in meetings or deals. He measured it in moments. Isabella found purpose again, not in fixing, but in loving. Ethan found his voice, not all at once, but fully. And one evening, as the sun set behind the conservatory glass, Ethan looked up at Alexander and Isabella and said clearly without fear, without hesitation, I'm happy. Alexander closed his eyes and held him close. The silence that once ruled their home was gone. In its place stood something stronger, a family. To extend this story further and make it reach approximately 1 hour of narration time, let's delve deeper into the backstory, add more detailed scenes, explore the characters' inner thoughts, and introduce subtle subplots that enhance the emotional depth without altering the core narrative. Imagine the early days of Alexander's marriage to Elena, how they built their life together, and the tragedy that struck. We'll add scenes of Alexander's initial denial after Elena's death, more interactions with therapists, and gradual bonding moments between the characters. This will naturally lengthen the script while keeping the style emotional, reflective, and narrative-driven. Before the silence descended, Alexander Harrington's life was a whirlwind of ambition and love. He had met Elena in a quiet cafe during a business trip to Paris, where she was studying art. She was the opposite of his structured world, free-spirited, with a laugh that could light up the darkest boardroom. They married quickly, and Ethan came soon after, a bundle of joy that completed their picture-perfect life. Alexander built his empire while Elena filled their home with warmth, painting vibrant murals on the nursery walls and teaching Ethan his first words with endless patience. But fate has a way of shattering perfection. Elena's illness came suddenly, a rare cancer that doctors said was aggressive. Alexander threw money at it, flying in specialists from around the world, but nothing stopped the inevitable. The day she passed, Alexander was in a meeting, his phone on silent. By the time he arrived at the hospital, she was gone. Ethan, only 4 at the time, had been there with her, holding her hand as she whispered her last words to him. From that moment, Ethan's voice vanished, as if he had locked it away with his mother's memory. In the weeks following the funeral, Alexander drowned in guilt. He hired the best child psychologists, speech therapists, and grief counselors. Sessions filled the mansion, doctors with clipboards asking Ethan to draw his feelings, therapists using puppets to encourage words. But Ethan sat mute, his eyes distant, clutching a small toy Elena had given him. Alexander watched from behind one-way glass, his heart breaking each time Ethan refused to respond. "Give it time," the experts said. "Trauma in children can manifest this way." But time stretched, and the silence grew louder. Alexander buried himself in work, traveling to New York, London, Tokyo, anywhere but home. The mansion staff tiptoed around, whispering about the poor little boy and the father who was never there. It was during one such absence that the previous housekeeper quit, overwhelmed by the heavy atmosphere. Alexander barely noticed, instructing his assistant to hire a replacement immediately. Isabella entered their lives like a quiet storm. She was in her late 20s, with a resume that spoke of odd jobs, nannying, cleaning, even volunteering at orphanages. What Alexander didn't know was her own hidden pain. Years earlier, she had cared for a foster child named Leo, a boy who lost his parents in a car accident and stopped speaking, much like Ethan. Isabella had bonded with him, playing games and listening without pressure. But life pulled her away, a job offer in another city, and when she returned months later, Leo was gone, placed in another home where he never recovered. The guilt haunted her, making her vow never to abandon a child in need again. On her first day at the Harrington mansion, Isabella noticed Ethan sitting alone in the conservatory, staring at the plants Elena had loved. Instead of ignoring him, she sat nearby, not speaking, just being present. Slowly, she began small acts, handing him a leaf, making funny faces. Ethan didn't respond at first, but he didn't run away either. Back to that fateful day when Alexander came home early. As he held Ethan in the conservatory, feeling his son's giggle for the first time, memories flooded him. He remembered Elena's laugh, how it echoed in this very room during family picnics under the vines. Isabella's simple explanation, "It's just play," echoed in his mind for days. That evening, as Ethan slept with the stuffed dinosaur, Alexander paced the halls, questioning everything. He recalled a conversation with Elena before her death. "Promise me you'll be there for him, Alex. Not just with money, but with your heart." He had nodded then, but now he saw how he had failed. Downstairs, Isabella hummed an old lullaby while cleaning, a song her own mother had sung to her. When Alexander asked how she did it, her answer, "I played," frustrated him at first. But as the night wore on, he sat in his study, replaying the scene, realizing play was what Elena had always done with Ethan, what he himself had forgotten in his pursuit of success. The following days brought tentative progress. Alexander canceled more meetings, lingering at home to observe Isabella's methods. She involved Ethan in chores, turning dusting into a game where they pretended to be explorers hunting for treasure. Ethan began to mimic her movements, his face lighting up occasionally. One rainy afternoon, Isabella set up a makeshift tent in the living room with sheets and chairs. Ethan crawled inside, and for the first time, made a soft sound, a hum of contentment. Alexander, watching from afar, felt a mix of jealousy and awe. Why couldn't he elicit that? That night, he tried reading to Ethan, but his voice was stiff, formal. Ethan fidgeted, but didn't pull away. It was a start. As weeks turned into months, the bond deepened. Isabella shared more of her past in quiet moments, like when they sat in the conservatory after Ethan was asleep. She spoke of Leo, her voice cracking as she described the regret that drove her to stay with Ethan no matter what. Alexander opened up too, confessing how Elena's death had shattered him, how work became his escape. "I thought providing was enough," he admitted. Isabella listened without judgment, her presence a balm. Ethan, sensing the shift, began testing boundaries. One day, he knocked over a vase in anger, the crash echoing like his unspoken grief. Instead of scolding, Isabella helped him pick up the pieces, turning it into a lesson about forgiveness. Alexander watched, learning to respond with patience rather than frustration. Subtle challenges arose. Alexander's business partners grew impatient, sending emails demanding his return. A particularly tense call from a major investor left him rattled, questioning if he could balance both worlds. Meanwhile, Ethan had setbacks, nights of nightmares where he woke screaming silently, his body trembling. Isabella would soothe him with stories of brave animals, while Alexander held him, whispering assurances. Gradually, Ethan's words emerged more frequently. "Juice," he said one morning at breakfast. Alexander nearly dropped the pitcher in excitement, but Isabella's calm nod reminded him to respond normally. "Here you go," he said, pouring it steadily. To add depth, let's explore a subplot where Alexander reconnects with old friends who knew Elena. One evening, an old college buddy visited, sharing memories of Elena's vibrant spirit. "She always said you were too serious, Alex. Lighten up for the kid." It stung, but inspired Alexander to try playful activities, like building sandcastles in the backyard sandbox Isabella set up. Ethan joined in, his laughter returning. Isabella encouraged these moments, stepping back to let father and son bond. As the story progresses toward resolution, extend the scenes of opening Elena's room. Alexander didn't just unlock it, he spent nights alone there first, touching her belongings, crying over letters she wrote. When he finally invited Ethan in, they spent hours sorting through photos, Ethan pointing and whispering, "Mama happy." Isabella helped transform the space into a memory room, with Elena's art on display. Ethan's questions grew. Why sick? Alexander answered honestly, sharing stories of Elena's strength, turning grief into shared remembrance. The visitor subplot expands. Victoria returned once more, threatening legal action over neglect, forcing Alexander to consult lawyers. This tension tested the family unit, but ultimately strengthened it when Ethan, in a burst of words, said, "No go," to Victoria, defending his home. Alexander's resignation wasn't abrupt. It came after soul-searching walks in the park with Ethan and Isabella, realizing wealth meant nothing without them. In the final months, add scenes of normalcy, family outings to the zoo, where Ethan named animals aloud, baking cookies with Isabella, flour everywhere, Alexander teaching Ethan to ride a bike, falls and triumphs alike. Ethan's voice fully returned, sentences flowing. The emotional peak. A quiet anniversary of Elena's death, where they released lanterns in the conservatory, Ethan saying, "Mama see us." Alexander and Isabella's relationship deepened subtly, from gratitude to quiet love, culminating in his proposal to make her part of the family officially. Dear viewers, this story was not just about a quiet child or a wealthy man with a grand house. It was about pain that hides in silence and love that speaks without words. It was about a little boy who lost his voice, a father who almost lost his way, and a woman who chose not to walk past suffering when it was easier to look away. If this story touched your heart even a little, then it means you felt what they felt: fear, hope, loss, and healing. Stories like this remind us that money cannot replace presence, and silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means someone is waiting to be seen, to be held, to be understood. Ethan did not need to be fixed. He needed someone to stay. And Alexander did not need to be perfect. He needed the courage to choose love over fear. Isabella showed us that kindness does not need permission and healing does not need loud miracles. It needs patience. We would love to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what you learned from this story. Your words matter and your voice helps this community grow stronger. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need hope today. And if you want more stories like this full of emotion, meaning, in real human moments, comment, "More stories," and you will be the first to receive the next emotional story we share. Before you go, answer these questions in the comments section. 1. What moment in this story touched your heart the most and why? 2. Do you believe love and presence can heal pain more than money and power? 3. If you were Alexander, what choice would you have made for your child? Thank you for watching and thank you for staying until the end.